Hi, everyone, and welcome to our early 2020 Outlook webinar from Pharma Intelligence. I am Dominique Fontanilla, Therapeutic Area Director for CNS and Immunology and Inflammation, and I am joined today by Michael Haydock, our Director of Infectious Diseases and Cardiovascular and Metabolic Diseases.
Hi, everybody.
Also, Zach McClellan, our Therapeutic Area Director of Oncology and Respiratory Diseases.
Hi, everybody.
And also Hannah Cohen, one of our analysts and NASH experts who is on the infectious diseases and CV and metabolic team.
Hi, everyone.
So this webinar accompanies our early 2020 Outlook report from Biomed Tracker, where we cover catalysts from 33 drugs, devices, diagnostics, and deals expected to occur this quarter and also early into Q2. In addition to a complete list of large impact catalysts, you will also see the results of the catalysts that were highlighted in our Outlook report from the fourth quarter of 2019. So just a bit of housekeeping. I also wanted to let you know that we will be recording this webinar and sending out the recording and slides to those who have registered. But in today's webinar, Michael, Zach, Hannah, and I will be taking you through some upcoming or recently occurred, as the case may be with one of my drugs, catalysts that we've hand-selected to speak about to you today. I will be starting off the webinar speaking about two drugs within the migraine space, followed by Hannah, who will be talking about Oncology and NASH. Then Michael will take us through highlights for the NanoFlu vaccine for influenza prevention. And then finally, Zach will end today's webinar talking about a CAR-T in development for multiple myeloma and Risentin in ovarian cancer. To start us off, I'll be speaking about two drugs in the migraine space, Lundbeck's Vyepti and Biohaven's Rimegepant. They both belong to the calcitonin gene-related peptide, or CGRP class of drugs, which has recently brought a renewed excitement to the migraine field. As many of you know, migraine headaches are common and they are also very disabling, such that patients often can't work or care for their families or perform daily activities. Migraine can last anywhere from 4 to 72 hours, and also while some patients experience migraines a few days a month or per year, the more severe cases in this disease will experience migraine attacks multiple times per week. Their chronic nature also means that adults are affected throughout their lifespans, and the vast majority of patients, around 85%, are women. So prior to last Friday, when Vyepti was approved, Biomed Tracker had a positive likelihood of approval, or LOA, of 91%, which is 8% above the average for drugs at the application stage in migraine, nicely complementing the drug's approval on Friday, which was welcome news for Lundbeck, as Vyepti is now the first and only intravenous preventive treatment for migraine. The application was supported by data from two phase 3 pivotal trials known as PROMISE-1, which was in episodic migraine, and PROMISE-2, which looked at chronic migraine. So with two doses of the drug, 100 milligrams and 300 milligrams, Vyepti demonstrated statistically significant clinical benefits over placebo. In episodic migraine, treatment with Vyepti resulted in an increased proportion of patients reporting no migraine days for at least 3 months as compared to placebo. That is around 18% in the 100 milligram arm and 25% in the 300 milligram arm compared to the 13% of patients taking placebo. Similar but more robust results were seen in the chronic migraine trial, where the proportion of patients experiencing no migraine days for at least a month and a half was significantly higher in the Vyepti arm than placebo. Of particular significance is that treatment benefits were seen as early as 1 day after the infusion, and this rapid onset of action is something that is incredibly attractive to migraine patients. The safety of Vyepti was tested in a total of over 2,000 patients, and only 2% of them discontinued treatment due to adverse events, which is great. The other drug, rimegepant, is an orally administered CGRP from Biohaven Pharmaceuticals, and this drug has a target PDUFA date between February 20th to the 28th. It currently has an above-average likelihood of approval at 94%. Now, in contrast to Vyepti, which was developed for migraine prevention, rimegepant's NDA is supported by two phase 3 trials, Study 301 and Study 302, testing the drug for the acute, on-demand treatment of migraine attacks. So in these two identical studies, rimegepant met both co-primary efficacy endpoints on measures of pain freedom and freedom from the patient's most bothersome symptoms, or MBS, at 2 hours post-dose. The onset of pain relief was observed rather quickly, between 30 to 45 minutes after administration, and this placebo-separated pain relief was still observed at 8 hours, which is pretty amazing. Biohaven is also looking to get approval for a novel fast-dissolving formulation, or an ODT formulation of rimegepant during this NDA round, and they also have a phase 3 trial which has successfully demonstrated similar efficacy and safety results as those seen in studies 301 and 302. This ODT formulation provides pain relief as early as 15 minutes in patients, and they have been returning to normal activity by 60 minutes. And then finally, Biohaven will also be releasing late-stage top-line results for rimegepant in migraine prevention this quarter, which will impact their potential to expand in this space. But that will be happening this quarter as well, which is quite exciting. So what do these approvals, or potential approval in rimegepant's case, mean in the context of the migraine market? So currently, the migraine space represents a very large market opportunity. It's the third most common disease in the world, with an estimated global prevalence close to 15%. 2% of the world's population suffers from chronic migraine, and in the U.S. alone, about 40% are candidates for prevention, but actually only 1 in 9 of these patients who are candidates for it actually get preventive treatment. In terms of the current migraine prevention treatments, there are a range of inexpensive, mostly genericized prophylactics. They include antidepressants, antiepileptics, beta blockers, and also Botox, which was approved to prevent chronic migraine in 2010. But despite these treatments, more effective and safe options are needed. And prior to the CGRP therapies, prophylactic response rates were not ideal. Patients still experience many breakthrough migraines and difficult side effects, which in turn leads to compliance and adherence issues for these patients. So just to give a little history here, the first CGRP therapies were approved for migraine prophylaxis in 2018, and they included Amgen's Aimovig, Teva's Ajovy, and Eli Lilly's Emgality. These approvals were the first novel approvals for migraine prevention since 2010. But the adoption of these drugs in practice has been slower than expected because it takes time for physicians to adopt a new class of drug, especially in a field where the patient's first contact is with primary care physicians or the ER or urgent care providers who may not be fully aware of the role of CGRPs yet in treating migraine. In addition, the drugs are quite expensive compared to what's already on the market, and payers have therefore been slow to accept these CGRPs. So Vyepti now joins them as the first and only IV-administered CGRP inhibitor for episodic and chronic migraine prevention, whereas the other CGRP drugs are subcutaneous formulations. So although it'll take some time for physicians to adopt this treatment as they become more familiar with this drug class, the drug is viewed as really a valuable addition to the treatment of migraine. This is really a disease where neurologists appreciate more drugs in their armamentarium, given that it's really highly variable from person to person, which makes treatment of migraine quite difficult. So as this KOL says, we have a shot of nasal spray and a pill, so the more formulations, the better. But a lot of people are going to find very appealing. I could see them coming into the office miserable. I send them across the hall to my nurse practitioner. She gives them an IV drug, and they have a dramatic response immediately. That's going to be very showy. So in migraine, the IV route of administration could potentially be a beneficial one, even though it might be not as convenient. The drug is infused every 3 months and actually provides neurologists with a way to check in with patients on a regular basis, which is good because adherence to treatments in migraine tends to be quite low. In the acute migraine space, triptans, which launched in the early 90s, are the prescription standards for treatment of acute migraine attacks. But unfortunately, patients who do not respond to or can't tolerate the triptans have very few alternative treatment options. So enter in Eli Lilly's Ravo, which is a selective serotonin receptor agonist, and another CGRP, Ubrelvy from Allergan, who beat rimegepant to the market when they were approved late last year. However, it did take these companies until last month to launch these drugs, and Biohaven has actually indicated that they are ready for immediate deployment of rimegepant and its fast-dissolving formulation as soon as FDA approval occurs. So it looks like competition looks to be intense among these three drugs, and this market will contribute to growth since they'll be serving those who can't tolerate or have insufficient responses to triptan treatments. So although there's a lot of competition, the migraine market is definitely poised for growth given the potential for label expansions into the acute or preventive treatment segments, as well as the approval of new drugs. And as I mentioned earlier, Biohaven will be further pursuing rimegepant as a migraine preventive, where there are currently no oral CGRPs available. And the developer is hoping to beat Allergan, or soon to be AbbVie's, oral CGRP atogepant to be the first oral CGRP preventive. So with that, I will take any questions if anyone has any.
Hi, Dominic. I just had a question about Vyepti, particularly its Promise 1 results, where the absolute benefit seems still reasonably moderate, obviously statistically significant over placebo, but still relatively low numbers. So I was just wondering if within the community you think that that's, even though it's statistically significant, whether it's perceived as clinically significant and therefore cost effective.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you look at the average decrease in the number of monthly headache days, the three CGRP preventives that are already approved that I mentioned, Aimovig, Ajovy, and Emgality, so all three of these drugs decrease monthly headache days by only 1 to 2 days compared to placebo, which doesn't seem like that much. And then Vyepti's data were even worse, as you mentioned, particularly in the episodic migraine population in Promise 1, where the 100 milligram arm resulted in a 0.7 reduction in mean monthly migraine days over placebo. The 300 milligram dose behaved more like the other CGRPs, reducing the monthly migraine days by 1 day. I guess the problem with looking at this endpoint is that it's aggregated from a wide range of data points. As I said, there's the data points for many migraine patients is highly variable. So to consider clinical significance, I think it's better to look at response rates, like the percentage of patients who achieve 50% or 75% reduction in their migraine days, which KOLs and also migraine doctors feel is more clinically relevant, considering some patients can experience frequent migraines that can last several hours to a few days even each month. For the chronic migraine patient cutting headache days from 15 every if they get 15 every month down to if you cut it down to 7 or 8 per month, that in itself is a significant benefit. So if you look at the data this way, looking at response rates, the 4 CGRPs behave actually pretty similarly. Data from all 4 drugs, Vyepti included, show that the highest percentage of patients with a 50% or higher reduction in migraine days ranges from around 47% to 62%. So around half of patients will cut their migraine days in half. Looking at placebo-adjusted numbers, the therapeutic gain range is pretty tight at 22 to 24%, which suggests that these anti-CGRP monoclonal antibodies have similar efficacy regardless of targeting the receptor or the ligand, and also regardless of administration, so subcutaneous or IV. And then all 4 of these drugs also showed similar proportions of patients who cut their migraine days by 75%. So Vyepti is pretty on par with the rest of them. But where it really stands out here is because of its rapid onset of action. So within 24 hours of infusion with Vyepti, more than half of patients were 50% likely to experience migraine. And then the other preventive CGRPs took anywhere from 2 days to a week to take effect. And also, apparently, they don't have any data demonstrating clinical effects before 1 month, which Vyepti has. So this data from Vyepti is certainly clinically significant. The other non-CGRPs used for prevention are even worse, and they take 2 to 3 months to work through titrations and also to take effect, which is, I think, incredibly discouraging for patients, especially when they have to also deal with the side effects during that time. But in terms of cost effectiveness, I think it's been difficult for payers to adopt these preventives in the last couple of years. Negotiations with companies have been drawn out because the drugs come with high price tags. Vyepti's price hasn't been set yet, but I've seen a mention of a $10,000 annual price before discounts, which is higher than the other CGRPs, which come in at $6,900. But recently, payers have been slowly coming around to CGRPs. ICER just this morning gave their blessing for the acute CGRPs, which is a turnaround from what they previously thought. But there are, of course, restrictions in place, such as prior authorization requirements and also step therapy procedures. I guess in addition, we'll also have to see what the future holds, because Vyepti, as an intravenous drug, will likely be reimbursed differently since it'll be an in-office procedure rather than a pharmacy benefit. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Were there any other questions?
Yeah, Dominique, I had another question, more of a broader class-based question. But are there any other potential benefits of the CGRPs over other established mechanisms like the serotonin receptor agonist that maybe you haven't mentioned?
Yeah, so the serotonin receptor agonists, or triptans, are, so as I mentioned, they're the first-line acute therapy of choice for those with moderate to severe migraine attacks. But in this acute setting where there's a high percentage of patients who either lack response or have intolerable side effects. So in fact, over 35% of patients in these randomized clinical trials studying triptans don't have a very good response. Also, the triptan mechanism of action is based on vasoconstriction. So patients who have cardio or cerebrovascular diseases, or also those with uncontrolled hypertension, can't take these triptans. They're also contraindicated in patients with comorbid depression who are taking SSRIs because of a possible risk of serotonergic syndrome. So CGRPs are particularly exciting because they're designed specifically for the underlying pathophysiology of migraine, and therefore they don't have any of this off-target toxicity. The CGRPs that have so far made it through development, they seemingly don't have any severe side effects and have similar adverse events rates to placebo, which is great. The dropout rates compared to the triptans are minuscule. I think, as I mentioned, at most it's 2%. And then one other benefit of acute CGRP therapy is that there's sustained relief. So as we saw with a single dose of Romegapant, there was significant sustained pain freedom and pain relief from 2 to 48 hours after dosing, which I think is a great benefit since triptans such as sumatriptan are typically short-acting, and the headaches tend to recur within even a few hours. So and then sometimes they come back even more severe, so they need to have another dose of it. So really, I think those are the greatest benefits that we see here. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, great. With that, I will pass it on to Hannah to talk about Ocaliva.
Great, thanks, Dominique. So today I will be discussing Intercept's selective farnesoid X receptor agonist Ocaliva and its upcoming anticipated approval in NASH. So Ocaliva is the most advanced pipeline asset currently in development for NASH, as Intercept recently submitted the NDA in September last year based on results from the pivotal phase 3 Regenerate trial in patients with fibrosis stage 2 and 3. Currently, Ocaliva has a likelihood of approval of 93% in Biomed Tracker, which is 4% above the average of approval. So this catalyst is about the FDA that has scheduled an advisory committee meeting for Intercept NDA with Ocaliva for April the 22nd this year. They have also set a tentative date for their approval decision for June the 26th this year. Despite Ocaliva gaining modest results in the phase 3 trial, we are expecting approval as it did meet the primary endpoint of improvement in fibrosis with no worsening of NASH with statistical significance. However, the magnitude of the effect in the treatment group compared to the placebo was minimal, with 23% of patients in the highest dose group of 25 milligrams achieving an improvement in fibrosis by one stage compared to 12% in the placebo group. As well as this, in terms of efficacy, Ocaliva did fail to show significance on the NASH resolution endpoint in the intent to treat population, which is the F2, F3 patients. However, only one of the two discussed FDA approvable endpoints is needed in order to be considered for accelerated approval. It's also important to note that Ocaliva does have a questionable safety profile, so it's associated with high incidence of pruritus, so that's an unpleasant itching effect, which actually led to 9% of patients dropping out in the 25 milligram treatment group. So to combat this, we expect Intercept to propose a dose titration technique, which is what they did when submitting Ocaliva in the primary biliary cholangitis indication, and this was accepted by the FDA. Also, in terms of safety, there was an increase in LDL cholesterol throughout the trial. However, this did return to baseline by month 18 after treatment with statins, though this could be concerning for physicians in a patient population that's already at increased risk of cardiovascular events. Regulators may also question whether there could be an increase in cardiovascular events if this is not well controlled with statins in the real world, particularly as use of Ocaliva is a much longer treatment and is meant to be indefinite. So despite the uncertainty we have around tolerability and safety, we are expecting Ocaliva to be approved, and this is expected to be restricted to F2, F3 patients, which reflects the enrollment criteria for the primary efficacy analysis, though this could be restricted further to biopsy-confirmed patients depending on how Intercept price Ocaliva and how payers respond to this. Intercept has also included the data for the F1 patients in its NDA filing. However, it's unclear whether the approval will actually extend to this patient population, as they were part of the exploratory analysis and not included in the primary efficacy analysis of the trial design. So the general consensus amongst KOLs is similar to what we expect, that Ocaliva will be approved. However, they do acknowledge its modest efficacy, with one KOL saying that, "I have to emphasize that Ocaliva is a very imperfect and flawed drug, but I think it is the best of the bunch, at least at this time. It is not a home run, but it is a clear effect." So again, a similar view to what we have. So now let's look more into the context of the market so we can better understand why this catalyst is important. So in the NASH space, there are currently no approved therapies, which creates a significant unmet need, especially due to the large size of the market and its high clinical burden, as it's associated with cirrhosis, end-stage liver disease, and cancers such as hepatocellular carcinoma. There's also a high economic cost due to association with liver transplants from decompensated liver disease. So as you can see, there's a significant unmet need with patients awaiting pharmacological treatment. So although the market is yet to evolve, the pipeline is saturated with mid to late stage therapies, and elafibranor is the next drug expected to release pivotal phase 3 trial data in April this year. So how will Ocaliva's impending approval impact the market? Here we have a patient-based forecast for Ocaliva from 2018 to 2027 in the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets. And as you can see, we are expecting rapid uptake of Ocaliva given the unmet needs, which is essentially creates a pool of patients awaiting treatment. In addition to this, we anticipate Intercept will strive for a premium price whilst it monopolises the market, which will initially drive sales of Ocaliva, allowing it to reach a peak of $7 billion. However, this pricing strategy is not likely sustainable, as when lower cost therapies with a potentially stronger tolerability profile enter the market, it's likely that this will cause Ocaliva's market share to decline and therefore forcing Intercept to lower the price in order to maintain its dominating position in the market. So it's clear that while there is huge untapped potential in the NASH market, aggressive pricing could hamper commercial prospects, and this is something that companies are going to have to take into consideration when determining their pricing strategies, as payers are likely to respond with strict reimbursement criteria such as prior authorization forms or even a pay-per-performance plan. And finally, Ocaliva is also in a phase 3 trial in the more severe F4 cirrhosis patients, which is actually another area of unmet need in NASH, as companies are reluctant to pursue clinical trials in F4 patients, given that cirrhosis has conventionally been perceived as irreversible. So it is encouraging that Intercept have taken this step into these more severe patients. So that brings my discussion of Ocaliva to a close. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask?
Yeah, Hannah, I had a question. So I guess it seems like Ocaliva's approval and uptake will rely heavily on like the unmet need in NASH, which would allow for Intercept to price it at a premium. But do you think that there's a chance that the company will choose to price the drug more conservatively in order to encourage the usage of the drug, given its questionable safety and tolerability issues?
Thanks, Dominique. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question because there's a whole debate at the moment on how NASH drugs will be priced, as there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, given that there's not really a therapy to use as a benchmark or any official report on NASH's economic burden on healthcare systems. So there is a possibility that Intercept could use a more conservative pricing approach, which will inevitably enable a more lenient reimbursement criteria and therefore widen the eligible patient population. However, manufacturers are likely to be restricted by regulatory bodies such as the FDA and EMA, which are expected to limit approvals of first-generation NASH agents to F2, F3 patients, which is mainly based on the current clinical trial enrollment criteria. So obviously this already restricts the market access, and in response to this, we do expect companies to strive for a more premium price, as they will also argue that there are long-term cost savings through reducing hepatic outcomes, and again, as you mentioned, the lack of alternate treatment options. Does that answer your question?
Yep, cool, thank you.
Hannah, I just had a question about the more distant future. I know, having looked at NASH a little bit in the early phase pipeline, there's a lot of interest in combination regimens. So how do you think Intercept's going to be able to adapt to the potential launch of those combination regimens? And do you know if the company's been active in forming any partnerships or investigating a caliber of any other agents?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, that's also an interesting question. So we do expect combination therapies to be the way forward in the future, especially because NASH is a multi-pathophysiological disease with multiple different aspects contributing to it. So Intercept hasn't partnered with anyone yet or hasn't announced a partnership, but it has announced plans to initiate a phase 2 trial to evaluate the combination of acalabrutinib and bezafibrate, which it recently purchased, in patients with primary biliary cholangitis. So what they've said so far is that their long-term goal is to seek regulatory approval for a fixed-dose combination regimen. And then once they see results from this phase 2 trial, they will likely expand the combination with bezafibrate into other liver indications, specifically with NASH.
Okay, thanks very much.
No problem. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Hannah, I had a quick question. I just wanted to get some more background information in terms of the surrogate endpoints used, such as fibrosis, sort of just more generally why they're used, and if you have any insight into how payers might view these endpoints in relation to estimating real-world benefit.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So the reason why we actually use these surrogate endpoints is that the slow progression of NASH and the time required to actually conduct the trial is significantly long, and therefore we use clinical endpoints such as improvement in fibrosis or NASH resolution, which are histological endpoints, rather than looking at progression to cirrhosis or survival. So of these histological features in NASH, fibrosis improvement is considered the strongest predictor of adverse clinical events by most KOLs, and these events include things like liver-related death. So this is a very important endpoint to look at. In terms of payers, they are wary of the use of surrogate endpoints, as it is unclear how they correlate to real-world outcomes. So as you can imagine, if a drug is aiming for a premium price solely based on a surrogate outcome, they're likely going to receive higher payer pushback in the form of strict reimbursement criteria, particularly in the field of NASH, which is of current limited spend. So after potentially positive outcomes data are released, the payers could change the reimbursement criteria, making it more lenient, but again, this does depend on the original price of the therapy. Does that answer your question?
Great, yeah, thank you very much.
No problem. So with that, I will pass on to Michael.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Hi everyone again. I'm going to be discussing today an upcoming catalyst for Novavax's NanoFlu, which is a hemagglutinin nanoparticle vaccine, and it's in development for the prevention of seasonal influenza. So it's produced via Novavax's cell-based process, whereby recombinant hemagglutinin, which I'll call HA from now on, HA proteins are expressed using a baculovirus vector inside insect cells, and then they're subsequently, those proteins form nanoparticles, and then they're purified to form the vaccine. So that process is a big improvement over the much more laborious and time-consuming traditional egg-based manufacturing process, And it's generally representative of a shift in the space where manufacturers are trying to move away from that egg-based process to much more efficient and rapid vaccine production processes. In addition, the fact that the HA antigen can be expressed without actually needing to grow a virus inside the eggs means that you can avoid the risk of so-called egg-adapted mutations. And for those who may not be familiar with the term, an egg-adapted mutation is a mutation that occurs to the HA antigen during the egg-based manufacturing process, so during the virus's natural replication within the eggs. And that can mean that the antigens produced at the end of the process aren't necessarily exactly as intended at the start of the process. And it's believed that that can compromise vaccine effectiveness. So there's a potential advantage just inherent in the manufacturing process of this vaccine. But onto the actual catalyst itself, we're expecting positive top-line data from an ongoing phase 3 registrational study, which is investigating the immunogenicity and safety of NanoFlu against one of Sanofi's vaccines called Fluzone QIV. QIV just means a quadrivalent influenza vaccine, so it includes 2 A strains and 2 B strains. And this study has been conducted in the elderly. It's worth noting at this point that the comparator is the standard dose formulation of Fluzone, so it's 15 micrograms of antigen, rather than a high dose formulation of 60 micrograms that's typically used in the elderly. That said, based on the previous phase 2 comparisons where NanoFlu has been compared against the high dose form of Sanofi's Fluzone and also Sanofi's Flu Block, which is another recombinant vaccine that Sanofi acquired when it bought Protein Sciences a few years back. We do expect NanoFlu will stimulate superior HA inhibition titers, which is just a measure of antibodies against the hemagglutinin antigen. And we expect it will stimulate superior titers against not only well-matched, but also antigenically drifted H3N2 strains. So in other words, strains that don't necessarily perfectly match the strains that are included in the vaccine, just because by nature it is a guess in terms of which strains are included in the vaccine. And that guess is made at least 6 months in advance of the season to allow manufacturers to produce the vaccine. So this vaccine has a potential advantage there, and that's backed up by phase 2 data, which Novavax released last year, where they did actually show that NanoFlu induced statistically significant increased antibody titers compared to Fluzone high dose against H3N2 strains. Another potential advantage that's worth noting, although a little bit more debatable, is that one of the secondary immunogenicity endpoints of this ongoing phase 3 study that we're expecting data for next month is looking at cell-mediated responses to the vaccine. So it's not only investigating antibody responses. And again, we expect that NanoFlu will be superior based on the aforementioned phase 2 trial that I mentioned, where NanoFlu induced superior T-cell responses to both Fluzone HD and also Flu Block. Now, the contribution of T-cell mediated responses against influenza and the relative importance is still quite debated, and it's not yet clear if stronger T-cell responses will lead to better protection, but it does provide just another shot at the target and another potential avenue for differentiation. So in summary, there are 3 main advantages of this vaccine that could potentially translate to superior protection, and that's the lack of egg-adapted mutations, higher antibody responses that we're anticipating will read out in phase 3, and also the cellular immunity. So if the data are positive, Novavax intends to file for FDA approval in mid-2020, and that will be based on immunogenicity and safety data alone from this ongoing phase 3 study. Because the vaccine was granted an accelerated approval process based on the earlier phase 2 data, that was quite promising. The company actually only has to do a confirmatory efficacy study post-approval, and that will investigate reductions in influenza morbidity and mortality, i.e. protection endpoints, rather than the surrogate markers of immunogenicity. And as I say, we expect this data to be positive. It would be a big positive for Novavax if they are able to get good data out of this study, given that their other lead pipeline asset, Resvax, which is a vaccine, another nanoparticle vaccine, but in development for respiratory syncytial virus infection, that's had a couple of major setbacks in the last few years. So the company has really shifted its focus to influenza vaccination. To provide everyone with a little bit more context to the market as a whole, Novavax is specifically targeting the elderly population with NanoFlu, and the rationale for that is that the improved vaccine effectiveness in the elderly is a major unmet need. The vast majority of hospitalizations and deaths actually occur in the elderly, As you can see, some statistics there from the CDC, just over 500,000 hospitalizations, 51,000 deaths attributed to influenza in the 2017-18 season. So it's a very high morbidity indication. And also to compound that issue, the CDC estimates that in the 2018-19 season, vaccination was only 12% effective in the elderly population compared to estimate of 29% in the overall population. So there's already a significant deficit in efficacy. And then if one looks at the strain-specific efficacy, effectiveness in the elderly was only 13% for H3N2, which is one of the strains that NanoFlu hopes to improve protection on, and 16% for H1N1. So again, clear unmet need there that could really drive uptake of NanoFlu if it is able to improve protection. And you can see at the bottom of the slide here, I have a key opinion leader quote effectively lamenting the poor effectiveness of current vaccines and emphasizing that there is quite a dramatic need to shift towards more novel vaccines like NanoFlu, like high-dose vaccines, and also adjuvanted vaccines. And on that note, NanoFlu will be quite late to the market. It's just one of multiple vaccines that have recently been carving out roles in the elderly population. So that includes Flublok QIV, Fluzone HD, which is actually the dominant vaccine currently in the elderly. It's the high-dose version of Fluzone, which has shown superior protection against standard dose vaccines. And also recently, just a couple of days ago, Fluad, which is an adjuvanted vaccine, a quadrivalent version of that was just approved by the FDA. And all of those vaccines have the backing of larger developers, so they're significant threats to Novavax. And they've also all shown in one manner or another improvements in efficacy over standard inactivated vaccines. So a lot of NanoFlu's potential uptake will depend on the outcome of a post-confirmatory efficacy study. So that brings us on to my final slide, which is the patient-based forecast you can see here for the US elderly market segment specifically, which we estimate at the moment has, well, when NanoFlu launches in 2021, we expect approval probably late 2020, but realistically won't be able to launch in time for the 2021 season. So in the 2021 to 22 season, we estimate the market will be approximately 1.85 billion in the US alone, and it's expected to grow to approximately 2.2 billion in 2028 at the end of the forecast period there. And that will be driven primarily by an increasing aging population, which will rise from approximately 55 million individuals aged over the 65 in the US as of 2020, and we expect that to rise to 68 million by 2028. So the main driver will be continued aging of the population. Our base case also assumes coverage will hover around the 65% mark, as it has done previously. But there is potential upside if more effective vaccines, such as NanoFlu, if that is borne out in its trial data, that could drive up confidence in the vaccine, or equally if there are more significant severe flu seasons like the 2017-18 season that get wide media coverage, and again that could prompt an increase in vaccination coverage rates. But really, for NanoFlu specifically, as I mentioned, the company will be conducting a confirmatory post-approval study. I suspect the comparator in that will be Fluzone high-dose quadrivalent rather than the Fluzone standard dose. I would imagine the FDA would require that, given it's the more appropriate comparator. And if positive, NanoFlu would likely become the new standard of care if it was able to show superiority to Fluzone HD, as it would be the only vaccine with a superiority claim to that on its label. Currently, there's no head-to-head studies comparing the more recent adjuvanted and high-dose vaccines. So that pretty much wraps it up for NanoFlu. Any questions at all?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I actually had one question regarding the phase 3 trial. So is there a particular reason why the phase 2 trial used Fluzone standard dose as a comparator rather than Fluzone high dose?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I must admit, it puzzled me when I first saw the trial design. I was wondering why did they go for the standard dose rather than the high dose. I suspect it's logistical and regulatory issues. So I mentioned before the term 2IV, and there's also TIV, which is trivalent. So NanoFlu is a quadrivalent influenza vaccine, which means it has 2 A strains and 2 B strains that are included in the vaccine. And because the pivotal trial design has to assess non-inferiority compared to a standard vaccine, it makes sense to use another quadrivalent vaccine as a comparator rather than a trivalent. And up until November of 2019, which was after the trial was initiated, Fluzone HD, the high dose, was only available in a trivalent form. So I don't think it, purely for that reason, it would have been the best comparator, because then they would have been comparing 4 strains against 3, which isn't logistically possible. So I suspect that would be the reason that they decided to use Fluzone standard dose, just because the high dose wasn't available. But now that the high dose has been approved in the quadrivalent form, as I said, I think for the post-confirmatory efficacy study, that will have to be the comparator. So I hope that answers your question. Just in the interest of time, I can see we're running a little bit late on time, so I'll just pass over to you now, Zach.
Thanks, Michael. No problem. So the first oncology catalyst I would like to discuss for the presentation here is for idacabtagene vicliocel, more commonly known as ide-cel. It's a B-cell maturation antigen-directed CAR T therapy being developed for multiple myeloma. Again, this is from Bristol Myers Squibb and Bluebird Bio. So in terms of the actual catalyst that we're looking forward to here in Q1, a BLA filing is expected in relapsed refractory multiple myeloma patients. Potentially, we may also see updated results from the pivotal phase 2 KarMMa study, which forms the basis of that BLA filing. Some additional detail on this catalyst. As I mentioned, Bristol Myers Squibb announced the BLA submission could happen in the first half of this year. Time is running short, but it still has the potential to happen in the first quarter, which is why we've highlighted it here. In addition, ide-cel has already produced strong results in the pivotal phase 2 KarMMa study in these heavily pretreated patients. Top-line data from the study showed an overall response rate of 73%, complete response rate of 31%, median duration of response and median PFS of 10.6 and 8.6 months, respectively, across dose cohorts. Importantly here, the highest dose cohort from this trial had the best response. Those patients received a dose of 450 million CAR T cells, and treatment with that highest dose resulted in a response rate of 81% and a complete response of 35%. In addition, Bristol Myers Squibb is investigating ide-cel in earlier lines of therapy for multiple myeloma against standard combination regimens in the phase 2 KarMMa-2 study and phase 3 KarMMa-3 trials, respectively. So in addition to this, what does it mean essentially for ide-cel and multiple myeloma in general? Well, there is a substantial clinical unmet need that still exists for effective treatments in these relapsed refractory patients. For some additional context on those ide-cel top-line results, available therapies, available regimens that include therapies such as Darzalex and Pomalyst have previously demonstrated response rates around the 30% mark in relapsed refractory patients, so the 70 to 80% overall responses seen from ide-cel are potentially significantly improved. In addition to that, as a BCMA-directed therapy, BCMA itself is implicated in the majority of multiple myelomas, approximately 60 to 70%, so potentially a large, available, and sensitive patient population that is on offer. Also, ide-cel, as I mentioned, is likely to be the first CAR T therapy approved for this indication. However, amongst the BCMA-directed class, it's likely to be the second therapy approved. The first-in-class designation will likely go to antibody-drug conjugate belantamab mafodotin from GSK, which is currently under regulatory review at the FDA. Belantamab mafodotin has demonstrated some pretty strong results in its pivotal trial as well, with a response rate of 31% and complete response rate of 3%. This sounds fairly low in comparison to ide-cel. However, in belantamab mafodotin's trial, those patients were treated with a median of 7 prior lines of therapy, compared to the ide-cel trial, for example, which 84% of patients were considered triple refractory. So as I mentioned, strong data from ide-cel, but also from competitors, so other BCMA-directed therapies like belantamab mafodotin, as well as a bispecific T-cell engager from Amgen, AMG 420, will compete strongly once they eventually reach the market. Both these therapies, as well as others in development, have demonstrated potentially similar efficacy in comparable patient populations, and they're not associated with the same clinical and financial toxicity of CAR T regimens. So, for example, we've already discussed ide-cel, but another CAR T therapy in development from Johnson & Johnson called LCAR-B38M has demonstrated a 100% response rate, albeit in a very early trial in a small patient population. So good responses so far there. AMG 420 has reported responses as high as 70% in relapsed refractory patients. And then another bispecific antibody, this one from Bristol Myers Squibb, called CC93269, demonstrated a response rate of 83%, again, in an early phase trial. So as you can see, there is some comparable efficacy across the class here for BCMA-directed therapies, a potentially new standard therapy for heavily pretreated relapsed refractory multiple myeloma patients. However, the competing therapies do not have the same toxicity of ide-cel or other CAR-T regimens, given that CAR-Ts are associated with significant neurotoxicity and cytokine release syndrome, and are also associated with significant financial toxicity that arises from the logistical and manufacturing challenges that are needed to produce the therapy itself. And to sort of drive home that point, a UK key opinion leader recently said that, again, I think it comes down to efficacy. If you are showing similar efficacy, you show that the BiTE has similar efficacy to the CAR-T, then the CAR-Ts will be dead in the water. So a pretty stark prediction there from that key opinion leader, which I think just highlights the fact that competition might be quite fierce within the relapse refractory setting, and in particular within the BCMA class. So I think that's pretty much it for ide-cel. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Just a question looking at that key opinion leader quote. It paints a pretty grim picture. So I was just wondering, if belantamab mafodotin did get approved later this year, what commercial potential do you see for ide-cel? And will it still have a place in the relapse refractory multiple myeloma treatment algorithm?
Definitely a good question. I think it will have at least somewhat significant commercial potential blockbuster status. I doubt it. I think in terms of launch trajectory, it might have a similar uptake to available CAR-Ts and other indications like DLBCL and the CAR-Ts there, such as Yescarta and Kymriah, which demonstrated fairly slow sales to start, mostly due to the logistical and manufacturing challenges as well as reimbursement challenges because of their associated high price. But I think it will have a place just given the significant response rates that we've seen, potentially best in class for the BCMAs, and potentially already demonstrating improved responses over available regimens. So yeah, I think it will have a place, and it's just a matter of time, essentially. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, sorry, Zach, I had one. So I guess what strategies will BMS and Bluebird have to consider for ide-cel to compete once it's approved? And I guess also, will developers of early stage BCMA CAR-Ts be less inclined to continue with development now that there's like the BiTEs and other drugs?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So I think in terms of the exact placement of CAR-T therapies versus these other mechanisms is still to be determined, but I think the consensus, I guess, is that CAR-Ts might be utilized more in healthier patients that can handle, the conditioning regimens and the wait times associated with manufacture of the CAR-Ts, whereas some of the other mechanisms, like the ADC belantamab mafodotin, which is a monotherapy, could be applied in those less healthy or more frail patients, and potentially as a bridging therapy to other treatments. So I think there is a place for the CAR-Ts, particularly in the more healthy, more robust relapsed refractory multiple myeloma patients. And because of the efficacy that they've demonstrated, I think there is a place for additional CAR-Ts in that space as well. In terms of intra-CAR-T competition and which ones are better than the others, we really don't know at this stage. But as I mentioned previously, some of the others like LCAR have demonstrated strong results in early phase trials, and if replicated later on, they could take market share from ide-cel, which is likely to reach the market first compared to the other CAR-Ts. So I think there is both a place within the setting itself, relapsed refractory multiple myeloma, and then within the CAR-T class itself, I think there's definitely room.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, in the interest of time, I think we can move on to the next oncology catalyst, which is Risentin. This is a VEGF inhibitor from AstraZeneca being developed in ovarian cancer. And the specific catalyst that we are looking forward to here is top-line results from the pivotal phase 2 Concerto study in ovarian cancer. The top-line results, as I mentioned, are expected soon. It is testing Risentin in combination with Lynparza in platinum-resistant ovarian cancer patients who have received at least 3 prior lines of therapy, and those who, importantly, do not carry or are suspected of carrying a BRCA mutation. So a strong readout from this trial could facilitate a regulatory filing in the second half of this year and potentially provide a pathway to approval for Risentin, which has had a somewhat uneven development pathway. So in addition to that, some additional context. As I mentioned, the uneven development pathway, Risentin in combination with Lynparza, the PARP inhibitor, previously demonstrated early signs of efficacy in ovarian cancer in a phase 1/2 trial, again for platinum-sensitive patients, this time with BRCA mutations and more broadly homologous recombination deficiencies and other mutations. The trial itself, the combination nearly doubled PFS over Lynparza alone, which seems pretty significant. However, there were such high rates of serious TKI-associated adverse events, such as hypertension and diarrhea. I believe it was grade 3 and 4 adverse events were seen in 70% of patients, that the tolerability profile was such that this trial was ultimately deemed a failure. Similarly, more in terms of that uneven development pathway, Risentin in combination with chemotherapy performed poorly in the phase 3 ICON-6 trial, again for recurrent platinum-sensitive patients. The Risentin chemotherapy followed by a maintenance regimen of Risentin did improve PFS by a statistically significant but not necessarily clinically significant 2 months, considering it was only over placebo. And again, patients discontinued Risentin at a high rate due to that significant toxicity. Based on that significant PFS improvement, statistically significant anyway, and because of a lack of available regimens at the time, AstraZeneca did submit an MAA with the EMA, but this was later withdrawn due to those tolerability concerns. So circling back to Concerto and what this study could mean for Risentin as well as Lynparza and AstraZeneca as a whole, if these top-line results do come out positive and a potential regulatory filing is ultimately approved, this could improve or expand, Lynparza's current label in the ovarian cancer space, as well as provide a pathway for Risentin to start generating sales as another profitable asset for AstraZeneca following a relatively poor development over the last few years. So in general terms, I think that's pretty much everything. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question, Zach. So what's the rationale for using the combination of Risentin with Lynparza for this set of patients?
That's a really good question. I think there's sort of a two-part answer to that. The first part being there's a mechanistic rationale, and then the second part being there's more of a market rationale for this combination in this particular setting. Mechanistically, it's hypothesized that there is potential synergy between a PARP inhibitor and a VEGF inhibitor. Particularly when you utilize a VEGF inhibitor, it creates hypoxia in the tumor microenvironment, which in turn downregulates genes of homologous recombination. And if you remember, BRCA mutations and HRD mutations are a hallmark or a biomarker of PARP efficacy. So you're essentially inducing sensitivity to a PARP inhibitor using this combination, or at least that's the hypothesis. So that's sort of the mechanistic portion. In terms of the market rationale, the previous failures have largely been in platinum-sensitive patients for this combination and Risentin on its own. So what I think is happening here is AstraZeneca is positioning this potentially synergistic mechanism in platinum-resistant patients, which is an area of unmet need. So patients within this setting do have some treatment options available, but it's primarily for BRCA-mutated patients. For example, the PARP inhibitors can be used there, but they are most effective in those mutated patients. So a potentially strong readout here could provide a pathway to approval using that unmet need and a potentially lower bar of efficacy to try to gain that approval, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Well, we're coming up on the hour now, so I just want to thank everybody for listening to our early 2020 Outlook webinar. As I mentioned previously, copies of the recording and the slides will be sent out to you. Also, we took up the whole hour, but if you submitted any questions through this webcast, which I think we have a few, we will be collecting and answering them by email. But please know that you can also submit questions to the email address shown on the screen, pharma@informa.com, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Until next time, thanks again for listening.